I'm Chris, this is Offbeat Builds, and today I'm going to show you how I scratch built these Gorkanaut and Morkanaut models from little more than a few sheets of plastic. Warley's looted cousin started life as a series of templates, which are included in the description if you like collecting PDFs. The process for almost all of the parts is simple. Trace the template, score along the lines a few times, and then snap the plastic. For the most part, I'm using styrene sheet that's 1mm thick, or 40 thousandths of an inch. Obviously, you'll need thinner material for Heresy era models. For all of my Orky builds, I like to make the material look like that it was cut with total greenskin precision, so I attack the edges with my hobby knife. This is a 1-2-3 block, and you're going to be seeing a lot of it in this video. These are incredibly helpful when working with sheet material. They're heavy, stable, covered in right angles, they're magnetic, and I'm pretty sure someone has created a version of Doom that you can play on them. When the magic blocks won't work, there's always tape as a fallback. And just like that, we've built the main hull of the Morkanaut. This model was inspired by a giant dumper truck, which explains the shape, and like the main hull, it's essentially just a box made from a few sheets of plastic, so I'm not going to take you through the blow-by-blow account of every part. Anyway, once I had said box, I outlined the structure using 3mm square styrene strip in order to give the impression of a bit of heft to this part of the model. I find it's often easier to cut the parts slightly longer and then cut off the excess once the glue's dried, rather than spending lots of time precisely measuring and fettling the parts to fit. You gotta think like a big mech. Anyway, once I'd recovered from all that thinking, I brought these two parts of the hull together and glued on another fancy plastic box that was designed to represent the engine room of the Naut. Moving up front, and I needed windows, 3 of them. The tried and tested method for cutting windows in styrene sheet involves drilling the corners, joining up the holes with a hobby knife, and then filing the remains into a nice precise shape that will be hidden by all the orkifying. The window frames were glued onto another plastic box that I'm calling the cab because I'm creative like that, which is adorned with details cut from 0.5mm and 1mm styrene sheet, before turning my attention to some rivets. These are simply cut from appropriate styrene rod. Nothing too fancy since there's hundreds of them in the build and existence is temporary. After attaching the cab assembly to the main hull, I turned my attention to the rear of the vehicle and another splendorous plastic box, designed to house a couple of large doors, which were inevitably attached to the main hull. And with the assembly of said doors hand-waved away in a short montage, they too were affixed to the Naut. Moving upward, the engine compartment needed a vent. The frame was constructed from 2mm square styrene, and after a bit of tidying up, the slats were cut from 0.5mm styrene, glued in place, overlapping slightly to create the impression of louvered vents. After layering this onto another 1mm styrene sheet panel to create more depth, it too joined the party on the main hull. On top of the engine room, exhausts and other mechanical details were constructed from various offcuts of styrene tube and rod section, augmented by more plastic rivet and bolt details. The real dozer that I took inspiration from had this cool platform at the front that I thought looked a bit like a crude battering ram stroke assault platform. So another opulent plastic box was constructed and the top surface layered with treadplate pattern styrene sheet. This is 1/48 scale if you're interested in that sort of thing. I could have made a more detailed set of mounts for this, but it's all going to be hidden behind the tracks, so I made use of the mighty triangle. Once the battering platform was in place, the front walkways were tackled. The lower deck was clad in treadplate, whilst an upper deck, that was designed to support the vehicle's head, was constructed similarly. I made use of a 25mm base and some plastic offcuts to construct a neck joint, with the parts cut roughly to size and then sanded down smooth once the glue was done with that whole being liquid business. Evidently, I was eager to get this stuck onto the model, but first I needed to tackle the health and safety needs of the Grok crew. I wanted these models to look like looted industrial vehicles, so metal safety rails were the order of the day. I created a jig to aid the assembly using an offcut of MDF that I had lying around. This allowed me to hold the 1mm brass rod in place while the parts were bonded, and the best tool for the job here is solder, which I promise you is easier than it looks. First, I applied some flux paste to the joint to keep it clean and improve the flow of the solder. Then it's simply a case of taking an iron with solder already on the tip to improve heat conduction, touching the joint and applying a small amount of solder as needed. The same process was used to construct a pair of ladders for the front of the model. I taped the parts in place, applied plenty of flux, and then ran over each of the joints with a well-tinned soldering iron. Since the solder is much softer than the brass, cleanup is dead easy with the sanding sponge, and you're left with something that's a reasonable representation of a welded steel ladder. With the hot stick and the liquid lead cleared away, the handrails were affixed to the top deck, and ladders were coaxed into place on the front of the hull. And to finish off the walkway section, it of course found its forever home. While I was paying attention to the front of the model, I decided to make a representation of roller shutter doors, using some 0.5mm styrene and a bunch of rivets. All good stompy Ork vehicles need a head, and this one's no different. Like everything in this build, the head was started out as a peppy little box. I didn't create templates for this since I wanted to freestyle it. I kind of think the heads on these things should be unique. And even though both the Gork and Morkanauts that I built here are similar in design, they both have a slightly different character to them, which I guess is the whole point. So, the dimensions and proportions change for each model, and the details vary as well. I've been building Ork vehicle heads in this style for over a decade, and it's very much part of the model that I enjoy the most. Just disengage the brain and let the thing build itself. Anyway, philosophy lesson over, let's play with magnets. Now, I don't think the head really needs to be magnetised, but I do like to be able to remove it for painting, so I think it justifies the work. And I guess I put it off long enough, it's time to do the tracks. I started out making representations of the drive and idler wheels by scoring around the edge of some PVC waste pipe before finishing the job off with a pipe cutter. To turn the tubes into wheels, the front face was capped with some 1mm styrene, secured with CA glue, and cut and sanded flush. One of my favourite tools for working with styrene is a leather punch. I use mine to punch out some 5mm discs to form some of the surface detail on the wheels. And after a sprinkling of rivets, the drive and idler wheels were attached to a panel that follows the form of the track shape. Then it was time for a new toy. I bought the appropriately named The Chopper to replace an old plastic style guillotine cutter that honestly was never really up to the job. This one, while a little pricey, was invaluable for this project as each of the vehicles sports 56 track links with 5 parts for each track, and frankly, it did a great job. With the track links assembled, it was simply a case of making up a continuous chain of them around each of the track guides. The road wheels were then constructed in a similar fashion to the drive and idler wheels, though 10mm styrene tubes subbed in for the PVC waste pipe. And since the wheels were smaller, I could make use of my trusty drill to sand off the excess material, which honestly felt great. After application of some hex section bolt heads, the road wheels were glued into place on the track sections. Around the back of the tracks, a mounting plate was built up from some scrap foamed PVC that I had lying around, and this would allow for a nice big contact patch when mounting the tracks to the hull. Now that I had locomotion under control, it was time to start thinking about arms. I started with the solder joints, which came from my favourite kids' construction toy set, before moving on to make more, plastic boxes. The claws were constructed from 2 layers of 1mm styrene. I filed in a sharp edge profile and then finished the job with a hobby knife to make it look a bit more orky. The knuckle sections were constructed around each of the finished claws and then assembled round the centre of a chainsaw blank that I constructed from 3 layers of styrene. This assembly slid neatly into what I guess you'd call the hand, which was then mated with the 2 arm sections, before the application of a few dozen rivets. Time for pistons. These were constructed from 4 and 6mm styrene tube, chosen for their telescoping nature. These were sprinkled with a dusting of plastic offcuts to form some sort of vaguely plausible looking pivot point. The process was then repeated on the lower arm section. Of course, the arms were magnetised, but not so that you could pose the model. I included 2 magnets to allow for the removal of the arms for paint and transport, one in the centre of the pivot and one further down to lock the post in place. I've come up with a style of Ork vehicle weapons for my army that feature an Ork gunner embedded into the weapon itself, and this custom Mega Blaster for my Morkanaut is no different. This is the counterweight assembly that sits at the rear of the gun, and shockingly enough it's made from another plastic box, though it does have a slot cut into it to allow it to sit on the back of the gun chassis, with the arm assembly mounted directly above. This would look better with bolts and rivets. Since I've got to fit an Ork, he needs a seat, albeit a crude one. You shouldn't really complain though. If I was being lore accurate, he'd be a grot, so he's already well ahead in life. The front of the custom Mega Blaster started life as a sandwich of 2mm styrene sheets, with an outer skin of 0.5mm sheet to provide the detailed relief. The barrel's from a 6mm tube section, and unsurprisingly, it goes up front. At this stage of the build, the Easter holiday deadlines were looming, so I cheated and used a section of Death Dread arm for the custom Mega Blaster's receiver. And around the back of the gun, I included this little armoured gun shield to provide my gunner with a little bit of light bullet resistance. Since this is an energy weapon, it needs a big cable. I made use of these cast cable terminals from Zinj Industries and a section of their wrapped wire for the cable itself. I know I've said it before, but this stuff is so much nicer than working with guitar string, since it's got no spring to it, it just does what it's told. This was augmented with a couple of cable clips made from styrene rod, because even orcs care about cable management. And with the end in sight, I added a pair of twin big shooters on top of the hull that I cobbled together from some looter bits that I had in the bits box. And that's about it. I'm pretty happy with the noughts of Gork and Mork. And if you do fancy having a go yourself, there are templates for the main structure in the video description. These aren't comprehensive plans, and it'll be up to you to design your own head and guns, but surely that's the fun of it. Anyhow, next time on Offbeat Builds, I'll probably be doing something with, I don't know, Space Marines. Is that how you pronounce it? Space Marines?